I was folding the linen towels I had just taken from the dryer when my phone buzzed on the counter. Normally, I ignored texts until later in the morning, but something about the vibration felt different. I picked it up and squinted at the screen. The message was from my son. My heart lodged in my throat before I could even read the words. "Sold your empty building. We needed cash," it said. I blinked, then blinked again. I read it 3 times, slowly, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. They didn't. My son, the one I had raised, the one I had worked so hard to support through school and bad decisions alike, had just claimed he had sold one of my properties. My property. Without asking me, I pressed my thumb against the phone, staring at the screen as if it might explain itself. The building he referenced wasn't actually empty. It never had been. 6 years ago, when I had bought it in a part of downtown that few investors dared to touch. It had been a gamble. Now it was a small empire of storefronts and offices, generating income that had quietly kept me independent, kept me secure, and he had just turned it into cash. He claimed, without consulting me. My hands shook slightly as I tried to steady them. Setting the phone down on the counter, I could feel my chest tightening. A sense of disbelief rolled into something heavier, something like betrayal. I had expected resistance from family when it came to money. Yes, but not this. Not from him. I tried to imagine what had compelled him. Was it desperation? Thoughtlessness? Or something else entirely? None of it mattered. The fact remained, I had been blindsided. I sank into the kitchen chair, still staring at the phone, scrolling up and down the message as if doing so could rewrite history. My mind raced through the details of the building, the tenants, the rent payments, all of it. And then I realized that this wasn't just a shock. It was the beginning of something I would need to confront, carefully, deliberately, something that would demand all of my attention. I sank back into the worn leather chair by the window, letting the morning sun warm my shoulders as I tried to think clearly. My son's text replayed in my mind like a broken record. Sold my building. We needed cash. The words felt heavier every time I read them. My building. Not some abandoned lot, not a forgotten property, but a fully operational, thriving investment. 6 years ago, when I had first purchased it in a still gritty corner of Chicago's downtown, friends had raised eyebrows at my gamble. The neighborhood was just starting to stir with redevelopment, artists' lofts, and boutique shops, and I had seen the potential others overlooked. It had been a risk, yes, but a calculated one. Now, the building was far from empty. 3 storefronts on the ground floor generated steady monthly revenue. Floors 2 through 4 housed professional offices, each lease negotiated with care, staggered to ensure continuous occupancy. The top 2 floors had luxury apartments that brought in more income than I had ever imagined when I first signed the deed. Total monthly rent alone approached $142,000. That wasn't even counting the long-term appreciation, the tax advantages, and the careful renovations that had increased both the property's value and its desirability. I had built this quietly, deliberately, and over decades, a strategy of patience and careful observation, while my sister flaunted flashy investments and my parents measured success by outward appearances. I worked in the background. My portfolio wasn't public knowledge. My modest 2-bedroom apartment was mortgage-free, a penthouse I had purchased years ago in a building I owned outright. My life was private by design, a shield against scrutiny and expectation. Frustration bubbled under the surface. How could he, my own son, have acted so recklessly, so oblivious The building represented not only financial independence, but years of judgment calls, market research, and patience. Every lease, every renovation, every tenant I had carefully chosen was part of a life I had built in quiet diligence. A life my family assumed was insignificant because I didn't broadcast it. And yet, there it was, the building, my achievements, suddenly vulnerable to a decision made without my consent. I could feel a cold determination settle in. They had assumed my success didn't exist. They had assumed I had nothing worth defending. They were about to find out how wrong they had been. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sunlight fade into memory. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and old books, familiar and comforting. But my mind drifted back decades. I remembered long nights poring over lease agreements and renovation budgets while my family assumed I was simply working a job. They had no idea that each decision, each careful calculation, was building a foundation I would one day rely on entirely. When Marcus was in law school, I had covered the bills, the tuition, and even the occasional indulgence that made him smile. Victoria had married into a world of flashy cars and designer handbags, and I had quietly ensured that she never wanted for anything, even when it strained my own resources. My parents praised visible achievements, not the quiet diligence that went unnoticed. They measured success by recognition and social approval, not by resilience and foresight. I remembered the winter when a burst pipe in one of my office buildings left tenants scrambling. I spent hours coordinating emergency repairs, negotiating temporary rent reductions, and handling complaints without a single glance from the family. They believed it had all been handled by property management, but the truth was, I had managed every detail personally, from selecting contractors to ensuring insurance claims were filed correctly. Even on weekends, when I might have joined family outings or dinners, I was tracking payments, reviewing market reports, or inspecting buildings. I had missed graduations, birthdays, and countless trivial moments, all while my family assumed I was simply content with a quiet life. The sacrifices were invisible, as though they had never happened, but they had been deliberate. Every sleepless night, every calculated risk, every small victory had quietly built a network of properties that gave me independence and freedom. Bitterness surfaced alongside nostalgia. I had poured so much of myself into a life that others could not recognize. And now my son had thoughtlessly undermined it. They had all assumed my work, my investments, my very judgment, carried no weight, no consequence. Yet here I was, still standing, still in control, even if they had never realized it. And in that quiet reflection, I felt the deep satisfaction of knowing that my labor had been more than work. It had been a careful, deliberate claim on a life they would never fully understand, and one I would never allow them to erase. I dialed my attorney's number with deliberate calm. Though my fingers trembled slightly around the phone, the line clicked, and a familiar voice answered. "Dorothy, how can I help?" I took a breath, steadying myself. "It's Marcus," I said. "He sold one of my properties without my consent. The Morrison building downtown. He's claiming it was for cash the family needed." There was a pause. Then the sound of papers shuffling. "You're saying your son executed a sale without authorization?" "Yes," I said firmly. "He's claiming he had the right, but I never signed anything. I never agreed to sell. And it wasn't some small property. It's generating serious income and is worth millions." I listened as my attorney outlined the situation: forgery, fraud, grand theft, and the potential involvement of the title company. The legal terminology was clinical, but the implications hit me with weight. Marcus had crossed a line that could not be ignored. The consequences for him could be severe. And yet the remedy for me required careful precision. I laid out what I wanted. We need to start the process immediately. Contact the buyer. File the necessary paperwork. Report the fraudulent sale. Everything by the book. My attorney's voice was steady but measured. Given the value involved, we'll likely need to loop in the police and the district attorney. This will escalate quickly. Dorothy, are you prepared for that? I'm prepared, I said. And I meant it. There was no room for hesitation. No space for doubt. Marcus had assumed I was powerless. That my achievements were inconsequential. He had been wrong, and I would ensure that the law recognized it. As I hung up, I felt a strange mixture of tension and determination. The stakes were clear, and the path ahead required every ounce of patience, clarity, and focus I had accumulated over decades of quietly building my empire. This was no longer just a family dispute. It had become a matter of justice, and I was ready to see it through. The aroma of roasted meat and herbs hit me the moment I stepped through the front door. A comforting reminder of family tradition that now felt almost absurd. Marcus's BMW was parked at a sharp angle in the driveway, taking up space for 2 cars. Victoria's husband's white Tesla gleamed in the sunlight. Inside, Mom bustled about in her apron, humming a cheerful tune that made my stomach tighten. "You're here," Mom said, her voice light, but I could hear the unspoken tension underneath. Marcus just told us the most wonderful news. I set my purse down and forced a neutral smile. Did he? I asked, my voice calm, measured. My eyes swept the familiar kitchen and dining area, noting every detail, the family oblivious to the storm that had just landed. In the dining room, Marcus sat at the head of the table, glass in hand, grinning as though he had orchestrated a private celebration. "There she is," he said. "I was just telling everyone about the sale. You don't have to thank me." His audacity made my chest tighten, but I maintained my composure. I took my seat, sliding my chair back smoothly, letting the weight of my gaze settle on him. "Marcus," I said softly, "how exactly did you execute this sale?" His grin faltered slightly. "The paperwork, the deed transfer. Handled it myself. I'm a lawyer. I know how these things work." I let a pause stretch between us. The only sound, the faint clink of silverware. "You forged my signature." The words were calm, almost clinical, but each syllable carried the gravity of decades of effort, of labor that had been invisible to him. Marcus laughed nervously, attempting deflection. I had power of attorney. I leaned forward, letting my hands rest on the table. "Not for this building, not for my property. You assumed I was powerless, that my life's work was insignificant." Victoria's eyes widened, and her husband shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Marcus's forced grin faltered entirely, replaced by a pale, uncertain expression. I didn't need to raise my voice. My quiet authority filled the space, built over decades of work and careful calculation. For the first time, they were beginning to understand that the life I had quietly constructed was no accident, and that their assumptions about me had been dangerously mistaken. I straightened in my chair, letting my hands rest lightly on the polished oak table. The room was quiet now, everyone waiting. Though none of them truly understood what they were waiting for, Marcus's confidence had already begun to waver. Victoria's eyes were wide, scanning me as if she were seeing me for the first time. I took a measured breath. "You all assume I've been living in a small apartment because I've had nothing." I began, my voice calm but deliberate. "You assume that managing a few properties for others was my entire life. But the truth is, I've owned those properties for decades, including the Morrison Building. Marcus's mouth opened, closed, and opened again. But no words came. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth, and even Mom's cheerful hum from the kitchen seemed to have disappeared. I let the silence stretch, letting them absorb the weight of what I was saying. I own 17 properties across Chicago. I continued. Residential, commercial, downtown, historic, newly developed. Each one carefully acquired. Each one generating income that allows me to live independently and without reliance on anyone. That includes this apartment you think is my place. It's a penthouse, completely paid off, in a building I also own, mortgage-free. Victoria's husband, Trevor, shifted in his chair, clearly trying to make sense of it all. See, 17 properties, he stammered. Yes, I said evenly, letting each word land. And the Morrison building alone is valued at $8.5 million, with 3 successful storefronts, offices on floors 2 through 4, and luxury apartments on top. Monthly rental income is $142,000. That's not an exaggeration. Marcus, that's the reality. I leaned back slightly, allowing my gaze to sweep the room. I never needed to broadcast this, because I never needed validation from anyone here. My work, my strategy, my life, it's been deliberate, quiet, and independent. You've underestimated me for decades. But that assumption ends now. Marcus looked pale, his jaw tight, fingers drumming nervously against the table. Victoria's eyes were moist, a mixture of awe and shame crossing her face. Even my parents seemed momentarily unmoored, confronted with a truth they had ignored for years. I let the silence linger a moment longer before continuing. Everything I've built, every investment, every calculated risk has been my responsibility and my accomplishment. And yet, you assumed I was powerless, that my decisions were inconsequential. That belief guided Marcus's reckless actions today. And now he will have to face the consequences. The air in the room had shifted. Where there had been casual confidence and familiarity, now there was astonishment. A deep recognition of decades of underestimated labor. For the first time, they were seeing me as I had always been: deliberate, capable, and in complete control of my life. The doorbell rang, sharp and insistent, cutting through the thick tension that had settled over the dining room. Marcus froze, his glass trembling in his hand. Mom clutched her apron nervously, and Victoria's face drained of color. I stood slowly, calm but unyielding, and walked to the door. 2 uniformed officers stood there, badges gleaming in the afternoon light. Marcus Langston, one asked. Yes, he said, voice shaky. What is this about? You are under arrest for fraud, forgery, and grand theft, the officer stated evenly. You have the right to remain silent. The room erupted. Mom gasped and sank into the nearest chair, trembling. Victoria reached for Trevor's arm, her knuckles white. Marcus's confident smirk was gone. He looked almost childlike in his shock. Wait, this is a mistake, he stammered. It's family. We can. I stepped forward, voice steady. It's no mistake. Marcus, you acted without consent, forged documents, and executed a sale that wasn't yours to authorize. Legal consequences are inevitable. You knew that. The officers guided him gently toward the door. He looked at me, pale and defeated. I didn't know it would enough, I said softly. You assumed I had nothing, that I was powerless. That assumption is what brought you here. Outside, the hum of the city felt distant, muffled by the storm of chaos inside. I turned back to the room. My parents were silent, eyes darting between me and the officers. Victoria whispered, almost to herself. I had no idea. I felt no triumph in their shock, only the quiet satisfaction that justice finally, was beginning to take shape. I called my attorney again, confirming that restitution proceedings would begin immediately and that the buyer, Johnson Properties, was aware of the fraudulent transaction, the building, the property, the years of labor and foresight. Everything I had quietly built would be recognized, safeguarded, and respected. Marcus had always relied on the assumption that his charm and our familial ties would shield him. That illusion shattered. The weight of accountability now pressed down on him, tangible and inescapable. He would have to navigate the consequences of actions born from arrogance and ignorance. I let the room settle into a tense quiet. The officers departed, leaving a family fractured by revelation and action. I remained calm, the center of clarity amidst confusion and fear. My life, my work, and my independence had been threatened, and now they would witness the cost of undermining someone who had quietly, relentlessly, earned their place in the world. After the officers left, and the echoes of Marcus's arrest faded, I returned to the quiet of my apartment. The city's skyline stretched before me, a patchwork of buildings I had touched in some way, each a testament to years of careful planning, calculated risk, and perseverance. The dinner had left the house in turmoil, but here, in the stillness, I could finally think clearly. I reflected on my family, the dynamics that had shaped me, and the assumptions that had guided their behavior. My parents, caught between loyalty and shock, had never truly acknowledged my accomplishments. Victoria, so certain of her own success, had assumed I had nothing of value. Marcus had acted out of arrogance, thinking my life was inconsequential. For decades, I had navigated these relationships carefully, giving where it was expected and taking care to avoid conflict, only to realize that some lines could not be blurred. The revelation at dinner had been necessary not for vengeance, but for clarity. I understood now that protecting my life, my assets, and my dignity required firm boundaries. The trust I had extended blindly had been taken for granted. From this point forward, I would act decisively, not out of anger, but out of self-respect and wisdom gained over years of silent labor. Sitting by the window, I allowed myself a small smile. Independence had never been about isolation. It had been about ensuring my efforts and decisions carried weight. I had earned the right to live my life on my terms, to decide who could influence it, and to measure relationships by respect rather than expectation. The city lights flickered on as dusk settled, and I felt a calm authority I had never allowed myself before. The past could not be changed, but the future, my future, was firmly in my hands. Weeks later, the city felt different, though it was the same skyline I had known for decades. I walked through the lobby of one of my properties, greeting tenants who had grown accustomed to my quiet presence. The Morrison Building, now secure and fully accounted for, stood as a symbol not only of financial stability, but of the independence I had painstakingly earned. The legal proceedings had concluded. Marcus had made restitution and faced the consequences of his actions, and my attorney confirmed that my portfolio was fully protected. The relief was tangible, but what lingered most was a quiet sense of vindication. For years, my family had assumed I was powerless, a woman whose life was defined by modesty and discretion. Now, they could see what had always been true. I had built a life on foresight, intelligence, and perseverance, not on recognition or praise. Victoria approached me one afternoon, hesitant but sincere. "Dottie," she said softly, I never realized. You've done everything on your own." I nodded, allowing the acknowledgement without needing further explanation. Words had never been necessary. My life itself was the message. Even my parents, though still adjusting to the revelations, began to interact with me differently. There was a respect that had been absent for decades. Subtle, but unmistakable. It was not about revenge or triumph over Marcus. It was about the recognition of a life quietly built, maintained, and defended. Sitting in my penthouse that evening, overlooking the city lights reflecting off the river, I felt an unparalleled sense of closure. Independence had been restored. My work, my decisions, and my dignity remained intact. The lessons of patience, resilience, and self-respect echoed through every decision I had ever made. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to breathe fully, knowing that my life, quiet, deliberate, and self-determined, was finally seen for what it truly was.